And with that, I will hand things over to Rama. Thank you.
All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Rama Hamarne. I'm a board member at RPA. And as Dan said, we're going to get started with a brief land acknowledgement. So it is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And so I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today. Paul Singer serves as the Follow the Forest Outreach Specialist for the Housatonic Valley Association. In his current role, Paul collaborates with conservation partners in New York, Connecticut, Mass, and Vermont, and conducts school programs and manages communications for the Follow the Forest initiative. He originally joined HVA as an AmeriCorps member after having received a BA from Pomona College, where he conducted thesis research on the preservation of sacred forests by indigenous groups in Japan and India. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Rama. Very happy to be here tonight. So thank you all for making the time. And I don't even have to introduce myself because Rama did. I was looking forward to not doing that. So thank you. So I'm going to just jump in directly to what the Housatonic Valley Association does before I start talking more specifically about Follow the Forest. So the Housatonic Valley Association is a regional land trust and watershed organization. I am currently in our Cornwall Bridge office. We also have an office in Pittsfield, but we're working throughout the Housatonic watershed to protect its environmental health. And we have two big teams here. We have a water team whose focus is directly on the Housatonic River, and they have a clean, cold, and connected initiative, which is kind of similar to Follow the Forest, and it's focusing on maintaining and restoring aquatic connectivity throughout the Housatonic watershed and connecting people to our rivers and streams. And then on the other side of things, we have Follow the Forest. So Follow the Forest is a corridor initiative that stretches from the lower Hudson Valley all the way up to Canada. So it takes us outside of HVA's traditional Housatonic watershed boundary, and it has us working with a lot of partners in 4 states. And it grew out of HVA in 2016, and Follow the Forest actually didn't receive its name, I think, till around 2018. But when we first came up with the idea in HVA's strategic planning, it was something that we then brought to a network of land trusts in Northwest Connecticut called the Greenprint Collaborative. And that created a lot of momentum for it. And then it allowed us to take it and grow it out to other regions of the corridor. And so some of the our major goals with Follow the Forest, and one of the reasons why we decided to go past the traditional boundaries of the Housatonic watershed and go all the way up to Canada, is we're really trying to protect land strategically and do so in a time where wildlife is having to adapt their ranges and respond to in response to changes in climate. So not only are we looking to increase the pace of conservation, but we're looking to do so really strategically. And we're doing that by building strong regional partnerships, but also then drilling down and bringing a really hyper-local lens to our connectivity work and creating high quality maps that our partners can use to prioritize their land conservation projects. And aside from that, we also have a strong educational focus, which is near and dear to my heart. As a young person who joined via AmeriCorps, I think it's so important that we are creating climate awareness, especially with younger people, but also with all types of community groups who can then help us act in unison to respond to climate change. And we're also hoping that an initiative like Follow the Forest can bring more private and public funding to conservation throughout the corridor. So the focus of my talk today is really going to be on our conservation goals. And so here to the right, you've got a map of the Follow the Forest corridor. So you'll see the Appalachian Trail outlined in red, and the Fall of the Forest corridor, which follows most of the corridor. And all of the green that you're seeing are actually individual core forests. And so our first goal with Fall of the Forest is to protect 50% of each core forest. And I should also mention, actually, the blue outline is the Housatonic watershed. So you can see how far outside of HVA's usual service area this is stretching out. And so our second goal is to secure at least one linkage between each core, which is a little more elusive of a goal, and I will get into that more. But first, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what a core forest is. So when we're thinking about core forests, we are thinking about forests that we can protect that will help us maintain a resilient landscape, that will also maintain species diversity and ecological function as the climate changes. So a scientifically recognized minimum size that's been identified is 250 acres, which is actually quite a bit smaller than what we usually tend to think of when we're thinking of core forests. But given the nature of the corridor and the fact that we have a lot more forest fragmentation as we head further down south into the Hudson Valley, we decided on 250 acres as our minimum size. And we are then also removing a 300-foot buffer of edge forest. So you'll see that, essentially where core forests are coming up against any type of fragmenting feature, we're taking out that 300-foot edge. Edge effects include like increased light, higher soil temperatures, increased wind exposure. These are all things that are less than ideal for certain species that really need interior forests to survive. And so when we're thinking, at the most basic level of why we want to protect forests, because I think it's important for us to come back to that why time and again, is forests are really important for filtering our water and providing clean air and habitat to diversity of species, including the native brook trout that you're seeing to the right here. Native brook trout really like to hang out in cool, clear streams, and we need a lot of trees to ensure that there's proper shade to provide habitat for species like trout. And here are a few species that like to dwell in the interior forest. So we've got scarlet tanagers, red efts, a northern flying squirrel, and we've got a fisher here. So these are all species that really need core forests to survive and thrive.
Hey, Paul, we have a question about the core forests.
Yes.
So how do you remove the edge of a core forest? What do you mean by that?
That's a great question. I'm not the GIS guru, but I can tell you from what I know, a lot of the time, core forests are fragmented by development or roads. So if there's a road that's bisecting two different core forest areas, we would then go from this point where the road starts 300 feet into the forest. And that would be the buffer of edge forest where those edge effects exist, or anywhere where there's a house, we'd go from there and go 300 feet in. So a lot of the time when there's development, we actually have core forests that lose their core forest status because the core forest is being perforated by new development. And so that actually ties in nicely with the slide. I hope that answers your question, by the way. But we're constantly updating our core forest layer to make sure that it's current. Sometimes we'll bring maps to land trusts that we're working with, and it turns out that there's a golf course right smack in the middle of where we thought there is core forest. So having that local knowledge of communities we're working with come in really helps us with mapping all of that out. So before I move into the connectivity piece, because I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about that second goal of linking core forests one to another, I wanted to ask all of you a question, and I'd just be curious if you could just drop your answer in the chat. I'm going to allow about 30 seconds for you to respond. Which species come to mind when you think of climate corridors? and just type in the first thing that springs to mind.
Do you want me to read these out, Paul?
I would love to, because I actually can't see the chat.
Okay. So bear, bobcats twice, foxes, moose twice, songbirds.
Awesome. So I like to ask that question also because we think a lot about how we're messaging around the corridor. And so it's important to know what species are really resonating with people. Are there any more, Rama, or is that pretty much it?
There are 2 more: porcupines, pileated woodpeckers, and barred owls.
Very interesting. Okay. So I was kind of hoping somebody would include a plant species too, because when we're thinking about the Fall of the Forest corridor, we're not just thinking about wildlife moving across the landscape. We're also thinking about plant movement. So this image to the left shows current and projected forest types, looking ahead to the next 100 years. And so in the Northeast, we have these maple, beech, birch dominant forest types that look like they're going to be replaced by oak hickory forests. So it's really essential that we're creating opportunities for plants to move as well as wildlife. To the right, we've got a spotted salamander and a spring peeper. So I don't know, perhaps some of you have had the experience of driving on a road, probably at night, probably during a warm, rainy night in spring, in fact, and having to swerve to avoid like hordes of amphibians crossing the road. And so that probably means that you've driven near a vernal pool. This is what a lot of people call big nights. There are many throughout the spring, but these are nights where there are large migrations of amphibians moving between vernal pools to mate and lay eggs. Vernal pools are seasonal pools that form in late winter and spring and provide really important habitat for amphibians and other plant species. And if you're ever lucky enough to visit a vernal pool, especially at night, it's a pretty magical experience because you just get this surround sound of chirping frogs. But it's relatively easy to know where these amphibian crossings are if we know where the vernal pools are. So we actually have land trusts send out like amphibian crossing brigades to make sure that cars are slowing down and allowing amphibians to cross the road at night, because it's really easy to run over them. It's unbelievable how many are crossing. And it's also a great educational opportunity for families to, see a spotted salamander for the first time. So there's a real, actually, before I move on, there's a real need for connectivity. And the biggest reason for this is climate migrations. Species are adapting their ranges in response to climate change. Add to that, species are moving between forests to get to food, water, shelter, mating sites. It's really important that different populations can intermix to maintain genetic diversity. And sometimes species are also getting displaced because we're losing forests. So then the question becomes, where are those spots where wildlife is moving? And so that's been one of the big focuses of Fall of the Forest over the past year and a half since I've been there, is figuring out, where are the opportunities and barriers for wildlife movement within our landscapes? And secondly, how do we go about collecting that information at a regional scale? So this is a map of the Rensselaer Plateau outlined in that black line. And all those ovals that you're seeing on the map are areas where we think that wildlife is moving across roads and between core forests. And so the ovals that we have drawn on our map, and we actually have an online map, and I'll drop a link in the chat after my presentation so you can check it out for yourself. But these linkage ovals are mainly informed by the Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected Landscapes data, which was released in 2016. I think it was an 8-year study, And it was the first study to kind of comprehensively map resilient lands and significant climate corridors across the eastern United States. Add to that, we have in-house GIS capacity at HVA, so we've added linkages here and there based on that. And for the Rensselaer Plateau specifically, there is actually a study of corridors that had already been published by the Rensselaer Plateau Ecological Features Working Group back in 2013. So that was really helpful for figuring out spots that needed to be looked at further. So the challenge is that we identified 750 places that needed to be looked into further throughout the Fall of the Forest corridor, and that number just keeps growing too. It's very overwhelming. And so what we had to figure out first was how to go about assessing those areas. And what we decided was the best way to get a sense of whether these potential ovals that we had drawn on the map were actually viable connections was to get boots on the ground and ground truth those areas. It might be that somebody goes out and assesses a length of road and figures out that actually, wildlife can't move through the spot we suggested, but there's a pinch point where wildlife movement is getting funneled, 150 feet north of, where we thought it was. And so that's really vital data to collect as we're looking to protect land strategically. So our first step was to develop a linkage assessment tool, which we started doing a year and a half ago. And here I think I've got another warm-up question. So before I show you the tool we developed, I again wanted, kind of the first things that come to mind. What challenges come to mind when you think of wildlife crossings? What might make it hard for wildlife to move between forests? If you want to drop those in the chat, I'd be very curious to see your answers.
So while we're waiting for people, we actually had another question in the chat if you want to answer that. So are Maple Beech birch heading north?
Yes, they are. That's what it seems like, I don't know if it's a question of reversing that trend or just making it possible for plants to move more easily because, those climate migrations are a lot bigger than us as well. But, maintaining a climate corridor like this can help us have a more resilient landscape and can help us, hopefully ensure more biodiversity. So it doesn't mean that maple, beech, and birch are going to disappear from our forests. It's just they might not be the dominant species anymore 50 years down the line.
All right, so I can read the answers. Got fast moving cars, roads, traffic, road barriers, traffic, balustrades, highways, deforestation, and traffic.
So a lot of traffic there, and rightly so, because that's always going to be the biggest issue is wildlife and vehicle collisions. And when we're thinking about that, it's not just a wildlife concern, it's also human safety and an economic issue, which actually, hopefully creates opportunities for us to work with municipalities on this. In the bottom right, before I show you this tool, I think this is a pretty compelling picture. It's kind of cute and also devastating of a mother and her cub climbing over a Jersey barrier. And there's actually a study that was conducted in Minnesota where they were measuring bears' heart rates when crossing roads. And I have no idea how they attach those Fitbits to the bears' wrists, but they found that bears' heart rates went up 13 beats per minute on average when crossing a road, and that increased with the amount of traffic, and that actually mothers and their cubs were the most avoidant of roads and were usually waiting till night. So anyways, moving on to the tool, the linkage assessment tool we came up with is looking for opportunities and barriers. So we're looking for signs of wildlife. This can be really fun to do during the winter when you can actually see tracks in the snow. We're also looking at habitat types on either side of the road to figure out who's using this linkage and whether there are opportunities to go under or over the road if there's a culvert or a bridge. And we're also checking whether there's a closed forest canopy above the road, which might allow squirrels to cross. And then when we're thinking about barriers to movement, I think it's important to distinguish between what's a stressor and what's a barrier. A stressor might be a guardrail or a steep embankment. If you're a deer and you're climbing down a steep embankment and jumping a guardrail and then having to avoid cars, that's a very stressful experience. But if you're a deer and you're running up against a really high fence that you can't jump over, that would be a barrier. And I think it's also important to distinguish between human imposed barriers, like fences and guardrails and retaining walls, or just development within the linkage. So, there being a lot of homes and natural barriers like fast moving bodies of water. And so once we've taken all of that into account, we actually have people walking the road or driving the road, the length of road that we're looking to assess to figure out where those barriers are throughout the linkage. We're then asking people to think about what's the most significant obstacle, what wildlife species might be best fit to use this linkage. And all of this helps us arrive at, a qualitative score of excellent through poor, which can be subjective, but the form guides the assessor to make sure that, we have consistency in our data. And we also ask that people who are assessing areas identify ways to improve passage to inform future conservation. So the best way to go about collecting all of this data, we found, was to take a community science approach. So maybe some of you have heard the term community science, maybe you've heard the term citizen science. We like to use community science because not everybody who we're asking or who is participating is necessarily a US citizen, but community science is just scientific work undertaken by members of the general public. So when we created the tool, we made sure that it was very easy to use and accessible, so that, anybody who we train could then go out and assess areas on their own. And this is a great way to collect lots of data at a regional scale, but it's also a great way to get people thinking about, the obstacles that roads present and visualize how wildlife is moving across the landscape. And, also then get at the more essential question of, how can we do a better job of sharing the land with other living creatures, especially ones that are most at risk and that are most threatened by roads. Just as we need roads to get around, all of these animals need connected greenways to get around. So, we hope also that this community science project will help transform how people are looking at roads. And you might be familiar with other, much bigger community science projects like iNaturalist or eBird. These are all really important for collecting regional or even global data that can then inform action on the ground. So the next step is training and deploying community scientists. So to the left, we have volunteers at Flanders Nature Center and Land Trust in Woodbury, Connecticut, looking over maps before going out. They actually acted as a focus group to help us refine an early iteration of our linkage assessment tool. And to the right, this is actually a picture of HVA staff out with staff from the Rensselaer Plateau Alliance assessing a linkage several months ago. This has also been a great way not only to tap into Land Trust volunteers and give them an opportunity to contribute, but also a great way to work with summer interns, scout groups, schools, and youth programs. So I just want to draw your attention to the center image, which is when we went and worked with the RPA's Forest Conservation Corps this summer. So they kind of have a changing cast of high schoolers that are visiting a new community forest each week. And so we did 3 sessions with them at Stolleson Preserve, Post and Kill, and Albert Family Community Forest. So that was fun. And this is also once we built the linkage assessment tool, it then led us to building a whole educational program around Follow the Forest that we brought to schools in collaboration with land trusts throughout the corridor. So, first doing a classroom session and then grounding the learnings with an outdoor activity. So these are pictures from when we went out with the Indian Mountain School. And you can see all the sixth graders wearing their fancy vests and assessing a culvert under the road. So over the past year and a half since we've created this tool, we've made tremendous strides engaging volunteers and schools throughout the corridor. To the right, I included a picture of an area that's actually mostly assessed. This is kind of in the Washington, Woodbury region of Connecticut. The reason I included this picture is because you can use our online map to actually look at assessments that have been completed to date. So every time we get an assessment, we review it to make sure that the data is good, and then it goes up on our online map. And so you can then click on the ovals that are filled in orange, and it will give you information on how viable of a linkage it is. So,
Paul, we had a question in the chat. So didn't early linkages in the Western US and Canada show that after creating a tunnel or bridge under or over a highway showed the animals finding and using them?
yes, definitely. There are a lot of really neat wildlife bridges out west and in Canada. I included a picture of one later on. Those are less viable to date and in the northeastern US, although one would hope that, maybe we could have a wildlife bridge going over I-90 or something of the sort. But I actually kind of want to come back to this question because I'm going to be talking about culverts and bridges and how to get wildlife under or over the road in greater detail in a bit. So it's a great question and I want to come back to it. So this is just kind of to give you an idea of, of the data we've collected to date. This is the distribution of ratings, and the images we have here. The top image is of what's obviously an excellent linkage. This is probably a spot that, had we known it was going to be such a good linkage, we just wouldn't have assessed it in the first place. So that's something else to keep in mind, is that it's most crucial for us to be sending out volunteers to spots where we think wildlife movement might actually be compromised in the future, where we think there's a really specific pinch point where wildlife needs to move. And so perhaps it's not really worth assessing a spot like this that has a closed canopy going over the road and no obstacles and is very infrequently traveled. The bottom image is, the quintessential poor linkage, 4 lanes, 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, multiple guardrails to jump, and even what looks like steep embankments on either side of the road. So that would not constitute a good linkage. And then this is just a kind of a fun thing. This is a word cloud generator. The cool thing about this is that, as we've collected more assessments, we've now collected around 125 assessments. We found that there are some frequent trends that emerge in terms of the ratings that people are choosing for linkages. And so that's good just to know that there's consistency across assessments. And we're always training volunteers before they're going out. We often do, scheduled days to train an entire land trust volunteer group, or go out and train high school students. So we're trying to ensure that we're getting consistent and quality data. And then I won't dwell on this for too long, but we have noticed trends in terms of the assessments we're getting. So higher speed limits and quantity of traffic are, obviously trending upward as we're going from excellent to poor ratings. And the same can be said about the amount of development within a linkage and guardrails. So the most common recommendation that has come out of our linkage assessments is the need to protect more land, but we've also gotten suggestions to restore habitat on either side of the linkage, or replace culverts or bridges and create better signage. And we are reaching our goal of securing these linkages. So out of the 125 assessed linkages, 27 are considered secure. And when I say secure, I mean a linkage that has a good rating and also has protected land on either side of the linkage to ensure that, nothing is getting further developed there. And more generally, these assessments really help us achieve, better strategic conservation planning rather than taking, what would otherwise be, an overly opportunistic approach towards our acquisitions. So we're then using the data we have on linkage to, prioritize, to create prioritization maps for our land trust partners. And this is all in line with the fact that, we do in land conservation, we do just have limited resources and funds. So we want to make sure that when we are doing conservation work, it has the greatest impact possible. And other than just looking at parcels that are within linkages and core forests, in cases where it's a poor linkage, or if it's an area that is really highly developed, we might actually then look within core forests as well to see, how can we create a chain of parcels that are connecting to one another and ensuring that wildlife can move through there, especially when core forests are at risk of losing their core forest status. So the analysis that we're doing on all of this is really contextual as well, depending on the landscape that we're in. In the Rensselaer Plateau, wildlife flow is going to tend to be more spread out. But as you're moving further down south in the corridor, flow tends to be more restricted. So this is why I wanted to wait before answering the question about wildlife bridges and culverts. So when you have wildlife bridges like this is obviously a really expensive project, and they tend to build fencing along either sides of the road to make sure that wildlife is actually knows to use the crossing. What you see more frequently in the Northeast are these big box culverts, which you're seeing to the right, going under the road. So this example is actually kind of a good one because you can see that there's riprap leading up to the culvert. And so that's something that deer and moose would probably be shying away from. And so when we are then working with, a municipality, let's say, to prioritize a certain culvert that, needs to be replaced anyways, but let's prioritize this one to make sure that wildlife can move through it because it's within a follow the forest linkage. We would really be thinking about the substrate there as well, leading into the culvert to make sure that a wide variety of wildlife feels comfortable using it. To the bottom left, you've got what's called Cape Cod curbing. This can be really helpful for smaller creatures that might not successfully cross the road if the curb is at too sharp of an angle. And probably my favorite example are these landing poles that you have in the bottom right corner of your screen. This is a project that was done in North Carolina along kind of this 2-lane scenic byway that was making it really difficult for northern flying squirrel to get across the road. And so northern flying squirrels are funny creatures because they're really clumsy walkers and they can glide 30, 40 feet between trees, but they have a harder time of it when they're on the ground, and they're prone to getting picked up by predators, and they would have a really hard time dodging oncoming cars. And so after they created these landing poles, they actually set up game cameras and found that the landing poles were being used very frequently and were helping get flying squirrels from one forest to the next. So, these are all examples of projects that, we might then think about replicating in the follow the forest corridor. So I've spent a lot of time talking about the follow the forest linkage assessment, and I do just want to acknowledge its limitations and also other approaches towards collecting data on where wildlife is moving across the landscape. So for one thing, in terms of limitations, this is all very predictive data. We're looking at the road, we're looking at the landscape on either side of the road, and we're working with community scientists to say, we think this is a good spot. but sometimes that requires a closer look. And we can't always ensure that what we're predicting is actually true. And to that end, it's also another limitation is that it can be difficult to assess really busy roads. And so some of those spots that are probably the most crucial pinch points for wildlife, where there's maybe only one or two spots where they can get across the road relatively safely, those are really difficult places to assess because there's an inherent risk to walking along the side of the road and looking for barriers and opportunities. And so I also just wanted to highlight other approaches towards tracking wildlife movement, including game camera footage, which you saw on the last slide. This picture of the bear was taken using a game camera, so that can be helpful. Same with tracking. Wildlife tracking can be really helpful during the winter when you can see tracks in the snow, or telemetry, which is when wildlife biologists are banding animals and attaching radio transmitters to get a sense of their behaviors and movement. Follow the Forest also has a wildlife sighting and roadkill application up on our website that people can use to record sightings. And it's really easy to use, and it uses location services on your phone. So it'll immediately know where you are, and you can just submit what animal you've seen. So I can also include a link to that afterwards. And I also wanted to bring attention to other data collection projects, such as the NAC project. So NAC stands for North Atlantic Aquatic Culvert Connectivity, and they have a new assessment protocol that looks specifically at how wildlife is moving under bridges and through those kinds of box culverts, or even smaller culverts. So that can be really interesting to pair with the Follow the Forest assessment and overlay both of those, because it gives us a deeper understanding of whether bridges and culverts are passable and who can use them. So in terms of next steps, we're always looking to increase the pace of assessments. Right now, it feels sometimes like the number of linkages we've identified to assess is growing faster than the number of linkages we are assessing. So it's going to be really important for us to keep working with communities throughout the corridor to assess these spots, and also to deepen relationships with municipalities and DOTs if we're hoping to take on some of those wildlife-friendly infrastructure projects. And it will also be important for us to continue our data analysis. We have consulted with wildlife biologists on this, and so our linkage data can be used to help ground truth and refine some emerging connectivity models that are mapping paths of least resistance across the landscape. And our assessment can help zero in on those road crossings and hopefully inform connectivity models that are currently being created. Oh, I did not want to do that yet. I will talk about the volunteer opportunity in a second. Before I talk about the volunteer opportunity, I also just wanted to say, at a larger level, this work is really helping create a greater ethic of collaborative conservation, kind of founded on the principle that we need to be doing more and on a wider scale. And to do that, we need really strong partnerships. And Follow the Forest allows us to work with really large land trusts like the Rensselaer Plateau Alliance, but also with much smaller all-volunteer land trusts, and allows us to apply a hyperlocal lens to our conservation work and be very intentional about the places we're choosing to protect. And it can also help encourage neighboring land trusts to work together where the corridor spans town borders. Wildlife obviously doesn't know those borders. So Follow the Forest is a great way for us to work together and share capacity and resources and release a joint message and lend enhanced credibility to our work. So in all of these ways, initiatives like Follow the Forest that are corridor initiatives popping up throughout the country have the potential to really transform how we're working together. and how we connect with the communities that we work with. And in my experience working with students especially, I find that, most importantly, perhaps it allows people to feel part of something bigger, and see themselves within this large wildlife corridor. So, another piece that can be really empowering is contributing community science data, because we have a real need for it. This data doesn't exist for a region yet, and it's really helping inform conservation action on the ground. So to that end, we do have a volunteer opportunity for you. So if you'd like to join us, HVA and RPA have been working together to schedule a blitz of wildlife linkages in the Rensselaer Plateau starting on April 1st. So the idea would be that we would get together on April 1st and train everybody in how to assess the linkages, and then send folks out, and then reconvene at the end of the day, share how it went, eat food, and then essentially have the goal of assessing all of the linkages in the Rensselaer Plateau by the end of the month, which is ambitious, but we found that this is a really good approach towards incentivizing folks to get these assessments done, because there's a pressing need to get them done. So unless there are any questions,
can I jump in? This is Dan. Can I just jump in with a couple more details about that before you move on?
Yes.
So everybody, as Paul said, we're gonna do this hopefully month-long thing in April, and it's gonna start on April 1st. We're calling it Follow the Forest Day. It's gonna be Saturday, April 1st, and we're gonna have an in-person event at the building where RPA's offices are, at the Sky High Adventure Community Center in Averill Park. And basically, we're going to do some in-person training, and then we're going to split up into groups and go out and look at linkages on the plateau. And then we're going to have hopefully kind of an optional debrief session and come back and compare notes for those who are able to do that later in the day. So registration, the official registration isn't yet open, but we do have an interest form, and I'm going to drop the link in the chat for that. So I just want to stress, this is an interest form. This is not the registration form, but if you think you might be interested, please go ahead and fill this form out. And then once we open up registration, we'll make sure that you get all the information you need on that. And if you have questions about the month-long thing or about Follow the Forest Day on April 1st, you can email either me, Dan at RensselaerPlateau.org, or Kim Murdick, who is our volunteer coordinator, who is Kim at RensselaerPlateau.org. And then I'm dropping the link right now into the chat for the interest form. But please pay attention to everything else that follows after, and maybe do the form after you sign out or something like that. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Yeah, so, and since we have the time, I was thinking I would share this Follow the Forest film with you. This was a film that we created in January of this year, and we actually recently received funding to create a second film, which is really going to then be focused on our collaborative work with land trust partners. So much of the success of Follow the Forest relies on our partners, and it's also a very malleable initiative, and so we're excited to see where else our partners will take it and are currently taking it. So much of our work to date has been on figuring out where it is that wildlife is moving between roads, but it's also a great storytelling device, and so we hope that the film and other ways that we're jointly telling our story can help create real energy behind this and catalyze a lot of action. So with that said, here's the film.
There is a forest, the largest and healthiest of its kind, that seems to go on forever. And like all forests, everything in these woods needs to move. Above the canopy, through the branches, beneath its spreading leaves, even the very smallest creatures. Sometimes over great distances. The very air we breathe, the water we drink, all come from the forest. It sustains us all. But now, because of us, the forest has its limits. We've altered this landscape for our own needs. Animals now find it hard to move where they need to go. Our roads and structures are now barriers that keep wildlife from following the forest as the climate changes. The Follow the Forest initiative is making a difference right now. Working together, we are protecting and connecting our woods for all of us. With space for nature to adapt and thrive across our landscape and beyond. We still have time to make a difference, but we need you. Follow the forest with us today.
All right, we have some questions in the chat if you want to take those, Paul.
Absolutely.
All right. So the first one was, do you deploy the volunteers to specific places or do they go where they choose?
So we do have priority areas where we'd like volunteers to be assessing linkages. And so it really depends. I mean, sometimes we work with the land trust specifically to figure out, because sometimes we don't really know a town, we're not going to know towns in Massachusetts or in New York all that well. So we're really working with specific land trusts to get a sense of, where they think priority areas are. It might be that they have protected land in a specific spot and want to see, how good connectivity is along the road there and see if there are opportunities to protect land on the other side of the road. So they might then send volunteers out there. It might be that they're looking at a specific parcel and that having a linkage assessment would lend more credibility to a grant application. So I've seen that before where land trusts will send out volunteers to that spot to say that it's assessed in their grant application. So we really leave it up to volunteers as well, because sometimes volunteers live right within a linkage. And so they are very familiar with all the wildlife passing through there. And they're best suited to do that assessment.
All right, and another question. Do you interface with uplands to lowlands, climate resilient cores and connectors?
We do a bit. I haven't done as much of that work. It might be that there's even other people on the call from HVA who can answer that better than me, because I haven't worked a ton with uplands and lowlands, but we are working with RPA as well on the RCPP grant. And so, hopefully that, that's going to help catalyze more land protection in our part of the world, and Follow the Forest can help inform, where we're choosing to protect land, because there is more grant funding available for this region now.
Are you working with the Staying Connected initiative at all?
Yes, we are. Staying Connected is, and was in many ways an inspiration for Follow the Forest. And they've done a lot more work than us with DOTs and municipalities thinking about, wildlife friendly infrastructure in particular, and, choosing culverts to prioritize to retrofit for better terrestrial passage. So we have met with them quite a bit and they're also involved with a lot of advocacy at the state and federal level to bring more funding to improve connectivity. And we've also worked with the Berkshire Wildlife Linkage Group, which is in Massachusetts and has 2 arms kind of coming through New York and Connecticut. So they also have a lot of expertise and can help us get a better sense of where wildlife is moving in those spots. The thing that distinguishes staying connected from Follow the Forest, I think, and the reason why they complement each other well, for one thing, staying connected is a lot bigger than Follow the Forest and goes up into Canada. But also staying connected has, similar wildlife linkages, but they're a lot bigger, so the Berkshire Wildlife Linkage is a very, very big area. And what we're doing at Follow the Forest is we're then drilling down to, a much more local level and looking at specific roads and how, and we're also looking at smaller forest cores a lot of the time too. So I think they do work well together, because Follow the Forest is maybe easier to grasp as well for smaller land trusts, who want to figure out how connectivity work directly fits into their current conservation work.
All right, and one more. Is there any thought towards connecting with Canadian organizations in the future to extend the corridor?
It's a really good question. We haven't gotten that far yet. Obviously our map stops at Canada, and there's a lot of forest up there too, a lot more forest. So I think we need to think about also, whether that would make it make Follow the Forest more compelling or not. Right now, Follow the Forest is kind of bordered to the east and the west by the Hudson River and the Connecticut River. And, we hope that there will be similar corridor initiatives on either side of the Hudson River and the Connecticut River. But, that's not really for Follow the Forest to take on. That probably takes a different corridor initiative. So that's not really been part of the conversation so much to date, to be honest. But that doesn't mean that it's out of the question either. I think for the time being, we're really at the stage of creating strong partnerships with the land trusts that we're working with and going deeper into those communities. So before we look bigger than that, I think we need to keep building on the relationships that we've formed and not get overly ambitious either, because I think that could maybe distract from our current goals. We have a lot left to do in the current Follow the Forest corridor, so extending it to Canada would be too much for now.
All right, I think that's all of our questions up until this point. So thank you so much, Paul, for coming to speak to us about Follow the Forest, and thank you everyone for coming to listen. And yeah, you can see the links that Dan posted to Follow the Forest and also to the interest form for the April event. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you for your great work.